Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Today, my guest is Namratha Sastry, and she is Associate Director of Medical Affairs Oncology at Regeneron. And we talk about her transition and some of the differences between diagnostics, MSLs, and pharma MSLs and diagnostics companies versus pharma companies. Really interesting conversation. Little disclaimer, the opinions stated in this episode are those of Namratha's and not specifically of her companies. So I just wanted to get that out of the way on her behalf. Don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn, check us out on YouTube, and MSL Talk Live, which is the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and that's on LinkedIn Live. Hey there, Namratha. Welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing great. I'm excited. Looking forward to chatting with you today. I appreciate you reaching out. So guys, Namratha and I met, and I don't know exactly remember when, but we kind of met along the way. And one day she reached out and said, Tom, I have this really good idea for a podcast. And here we are. So we're making it happen.
Pretty much. No, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So why don't we start with an intro? Why don't you tell everybody who you are and where you're from and all that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Namratha, and I'm actually currently in Chicago. So I'm a PhD by training, and I completed my PhD not too long ago. I'm a pretty new MSL. I finished literally when the pandemic started in like March, April of 2020. And my PhD itself was in neuroscience. I went to Northwestern University. And in terms of the research that I did, I conducted some research in brain cancer. So my background is more of a combination of neuro and oncology. And I really enjoyed bench science. I really enjoyed doing research, but I did want to see what else was out there. And somewhere during the phases of my grad school career, I learned about this role called Medical Science Liaison. So I did a lot of work to try to figure out what it was. I networked with a lot of people. I wanted to get advice from a variety of different people, just so I could learn if this was kind of the right career for me. And then after I finished grad school, I decided to kind of step into industry, kind of take it one step at a time. I think many of the people who listen to this podcast know that the MSL role is not the easiest to break into. So because of that, I spent about a year working as a science writer. And that really allowed me to kind of see how industry works. It gave me a chance to explore the different parts of of a company. I worked at a biotech company called Tempus in Chicago. And then after that, because of the extensive networking that I had done, I did actually get an opportunity. One of my contacts reached out to me and said that she's expanding her team. She's looking to hire someone new. She remembered that we had a conversation a while ago, and she reached out and said, would you like to apply? And that was at a diagnostic company called Diagnostics. So that was kind of my first introduction into the MSL role. And as soon as I got into it, I loved it. It was a fantastic role to be in. I really, really enjoyed it. But the thing is, that was a diagnostic company, and a lot of MSLs are much more familiar with how this role functions in pharma. And I very recently, just as of July, transitioned into Regeneron, which is a pharmaceutical company. So kind of the way that this podcast came about is, because I had kind of seen two different parts to it. It's not something that anyone had talked to me about, so I thought it would be something that people might be interested in.
Yeah. I mean, I love your story. I think it's awesome, but let's go back a little bit. So before we get into the transitions from your diagnostics background to this more pharma focused world. So you said you started in industry working as a science writer. So did you know you wanted to be an MSL, but you decided to jump into a different position to start?
Yeah, kind of. I did try applying to a few positions right after grad school, but like I said, I mean, a lot of positions, MSL positions, they do want you to have some experience, even if you don't have MSL experience, even if you're an aspiring MSL, they want to see that you at least are familiar with industry because it's kind of a lot to take in at once. So took this position as a science writer because it kind of gave me that intro. I was still working in medical affairs, so it was nice. I interacted with a lot of other MSLs, but it gave me a chance to kind of like, get my feet wet and just kind of learn a little bit about how medical affairs works, how it interacts with other teams. And it also kind of gave me a nice backing when I actually, decided to transition into the MSL role.
Got you. Okay. So then because a lot of people always ask, like, what's the best way to break in? And obviously it's, sometimes it makes sense to take a little bit of a sidestep until as you're trying to make that step forward. So you get this position as science writer, and then you used kind of what I would say is old school networking to get your role, right? So it was just you asking around, networking with folks to get your role at Tempus, which was a diagnostics MSL role.
So no, at Tempus, I was it was a diagnostic company, but I was a science writer there. But
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Got it.
So basically, yeah, it was just networking, like, everyone tells you how important networking is. And I certainly learned the importance of that through this position. So while I was both in grad school and while I was working as a science writer, I would reach out to people that I found on LinkedIn, just people who I saw happened to go to the same university I did or had some connection with. And I would reach out to them if I saw that they were in medical affairs. And I would say, hey, can I have, 15, 20 minutes of your time? I just want to learn about your experience. But the nice thing about that is you get a lot of information from these people, and you get some really fantastic advice. But then you also do get to build your network because they get to talk to you, they get to interact with you. And if you kind of click, some people you talk to them once and, they might give you some useful advice, but you may not necessarily speak to that person again. But other people you just have a connection with and you kind of stay in touch. So I got to meet some really wonderful people that way. And one of them just happened to remember that she spoke with me, and she reached out when she had a position available. So
Awesome.
my jaw kind of dropped when I first got that the message saying, "Hey, would you like to apply?" But yeah, it just shows you that it's a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, that's exactly what we try to tell people to do. So I think you're a great example of how important it is and how effective it is to constantly be networking and talking to folks. So then you make this transition. So why did you go from that, diagnostics company into pharma? What led you there?
Yeah, there were a couple different things that kind of that led me to switch from Diagnostics, which was a company called Biodesics, into Pharma. And one of the main reasons that I ended up switching is that so my background, like I said, I'm a PhD by training, and I'm essentially a molecular biologist by training. And I really love kind of being in the weeds of the science. I love learning about like mechanisms of action, and a lot of what I did within Diagnostics actually focused on commercial support. So I certainly the MSL role is always going to be this non-biased, non-promotional role. But in a diagnostic company, we had a lot more interaction with commercial colleagues. I would be involved in sales trainings. I would be sometimes even involved in their field rides and things like that. And I wanted to do something where I was much more, kind of in the weeds of the science. I really just wanted to focus a little more on clinical trials. I wanted to have more engagement with KOLs, and I wanted that to be like the vast majority of the work that I did. So that's why I wanted to see what else was out there. So that's when I started, kind of learning about what it is to be a pharma MSL, and it just seemed like it was a better fit for me. That said, I certainly understand why people love being in diagnostics. Like, it's a very exciting place. The company that I was at looked at biomarkers, and you can very easily get passionate about that. But it just so happened that this was, the right choice for me, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like you weren't running from it. You just,
No.
you were in that role and you had the experience and just wound up making that transition. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think a lot of people don't realize what is available for them and what the differences might be. So what would you say are the differences and similarities of
Mhm.
a diagnostics company versus a pharma company?
Sure. So I think with respect to the MSL role, at least, I can kind of first talk about the similarities.
Hmm.
And I kind of already alluded to this. So no matter what, a medical science liaison and medical affairs as a whole is always going to be, a group of scientists um, who are unbiased and non-promotional. You're always trying to, kind of convey the good, the bad, and the ugly. You want to share everything, all of the data, and not try to like cherry pick in any way, and make sure that whenever you're speaking to a KOL, you are giving them the most accurate information that you can so that they can make the best decision for their for their patients. That's going to be the same no matter where you go. But in terms of the nuances, there are some differences. So one of the main differences that I learned about was in terms of the regulatory bodies that really govern these different types of companies. So with diagnostics, those are primarily regulated by CLIA and CAP, which people may have kind of heard those terms because of because of the COVID pandemic and just the fact that, many of the COVID tests that we used and are continuing to use went through laboratories that have CLIA and CAP accreditation. So basically, what that means is that these are certifications that diagnostic companies can get, and having either a CLIA certification or a CAP accreditation, that means that these are laboratories that either meet or they exceed kind of industry standards for testing. So it just makes sure that everything's kind of up to par, that they're doing everything that they're supposed to in terms of how a lab should run. But in terms of what pharma does, that is, I think, what more people are familiar with. That's actually regulated by the FDA. So the FDA can have some influence within diagnostics companies, but it's primarily within pharma. So a drug that's been FDA approved, it's been tested, usually in clinical trials, and it is safe and effective to use in the general public. So those are kind of the differences. I will note I'm not an expert on regulatory bodies, but just kind of at a high level, those are some of the differences that I've seen. And as a result, the kind of direction that comes down from those regulatory bodies influences how MSLs do their jobs. So
Yeah.
that's why when I was in diagnostics, I tended to work quite a bit with the commercial team, whereas in pharma, there's much more of a firewall there. There's much more of a barrier with how much interaction I can have, what I can talk to them about, what I can share. So those are some of the differences that I've seen.
Well, what about, so it sounds to me, just hearing you, the training has to be different, right? Because you have to be prepared to deal with those nuances in a diagnostics company versus how you might get trained for pharma. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are the differences on a training side?
Yeah, absolutely. So that particular question is a little confounded by the fact that I moved from diagnostics to pharma, but I also moved from a very small company to a very large company.
Mm.
So Biodesics has maybe about 200 employees, whereas Regeneron has, I think, close to like 10,000 employees. So that also, kind of plays a role into that. But because of the way that our team was structured, we were just such a small team at Biodesics. I did have some training. I had, some of the senior MSLs who would go through the content, the disease state, all of that with me. But in terms of a lot of what I did, it was kind of learning on the go. It was a lot of you kind of figure out at once you're in the field how you interact with people. I certainly there were things that I learned that no one had formally taught me. Um, and I think that, like I said, that's partially to do with the fact that it's diagnostics, but it's also just the fact that it's a much smaller company.
Smaller company, there's not a lot of infrastructure and support.
Exactly,
Right,
exactly.
right.
So I can't really speak to all diagnostics companies. This was just kind of my experience. But in pharma, I had a much more formalized training. I had, I think it was like a 6-7 week training course that I went through. And most of that was focused primarily on the content and the subject matter and making sure that I understood the science behind the clinical trials. But we certainly did also talk a little bit about, I've had like formal documents that have been shared with me about interacting with commercial teams and, when it is appropriate for you both to somehow interact with a KOL. And there are really very few instances for a situation like that. So there are definitely a lot more guidelines where I am right now than where I was previously. But yeah, in terms of the general the infrastructure, there was a very big difference between the two different companies.
Well, it sounds like one of the differences that's kind of standing out to me, other than that, that regulatory piece is the interactions or the relationship with commercial and marketing on the diagnostic side sounds very different from that in pharma. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was within the diagnostic company, it was almost like expected that I work quite a bit with the commercial team, because it just being, first of all, a small company and just the way that it was structured, we did have quite a bit of interaction with commercial. So I would kind of be their main point of contact for any sort of medical inquiry that they got in the field. I would help to conduct their training. And like I said, I sometimes even like accompanied them on field rides, and I would help them kind of be able to digest this information, because a lot of them don't necessarily have like a science background. So they would need someone to kind of coach them through understanding the details of what it is that these products were. Whereas in pharma, like I said, there's much more of a firewall there. Occasionally, I'll have like a sales rep introduce me to a KOL or vice versa, and I do respond to medical inquiries, but it's a much more formalized process, and that's really kind of the limit of my interaction with them. And I do know that I've heard that from other pharma companies, MSLs and sales reps, like they might not even know each other's names. Like, you have a very, very strict limit as to what kind of interaction you can have.
Yeah, well, that is true. I mean, obviously, there is that. I would say, just listening to you, that seems to be one of the things that stands out most is, how strict it is on the pharma side, because obviously, no one wants to get hit with the CIA. They want everybody to be, fully educated and aware of the ramifications of what could happen if you're not fully compliant. But what about KOL interactions? What are the differences between the two when you look at KOL interactions on the diagnostic side versus that of your pharma MSLs?
Yes. So in terms of KOL interactions, I've noticed a few things that are different there as well. When I was at Biodesics, things were a lot more, I was allowed to be much more proactive. I was allowed to share some information with them. So if we presented something at a conference recently, it was kind of, as long as it was kind of publicly presented, I would be able to share with them and say, these are some of the new data that we have for this one clinical trial, or somehow share with them that we have some new information from the company. So that was kind of like, it was certainly not promotional in any way, but I was allowed to share some information like that. But at Regeneron, there's a lot more scrutiny to what can be shared externally, and much more of the focus is on being reactive. So any information that's kind of on label, I can share, but in terms of the majority of my work, I really primarily focus on pipeline data and clinical trial results, and a lot of that has to be reactive. So it's only if someone asks me like, hey, are you working on this? Then I can respond to that, but I can't come out and say anything myself.
Got you. Interesting. So, like, hearing you talk, it sounds like you enjoyed both experiences, right? So you've got some very positive things to say about being a diagnostics MSL versus being a pharma MSL. Would you say that you have I don't put you on your spot by asking you this, but do you have a preference?
So like I said, I can certainly see like the pros and cons of each of them. I think that they both have differences that might fit certain personality types more than others. I think I prefer pharma just because in my experience so far, first of all, I just happen to be on a wonderful team. I really like my manager. I just have a great experience. I've had a great experience so far. But also just the fact that I get to be so deep within the science, and I get to really support our pipeline, which is really extensive. So I think many MSLs are just lifelong learners, and we get excited when we get to learn something new. So the fact that I've gotten to learn about so many different disease states and so many different mechanisms, that is something that I've really enjoyed. So just personally, I can say that I think fit better within pharma. But even when I was at Biodesics, I really did love, learning about the trials that we had, about the diagnostic tests. It was kind of a new realm for me. A lot of that was dealing with artificial intelligence, machine learning. So I still got to learn a lot of new things. But just so far with my experience, I think I'm, a better fit for pharma.
Okay, interesting. And you also went from a small company to a larger company. So how was that transition, and is there a preference on that side?
Yeah, that one was it was definitely kind of a culture shock to go from a place where I knew just about the whole company, it felt like I remember there was a conference that I had gone to, I think it was like ASCO or something, and our like CSO came up and gave me a hug just because we had a good relationship. So it was a place where I kind of knew everybody. And now I feel a little more like a small fish in a big pond just because now with 10,000 people, I definitely don't know everybody. Um, so I think because of that, it's a little bit of a shift. And I did kind of like having that kind of intimate environment where I was able to really get to know all of my colleagues really well, really be able to work across teams very easily. And, if I needed something from, say, like the director of marketing, I knew exactly who he was. I could pick up the phone and call him if I wanted. But now, if I wanted to do something like that, I would probably have to ask my supervisor who that is, and they would connect me with someone within marketing, and they would like route me to the right person. It's much more of a roundabout way, and that's just kind of it's intrinsic to being in a large company. So I did like that intimate environment, but I think that you can kind of learn to love wherever you are, because even though I'm at a large company, the actual people that I interact with, it is a much smaller team. It is kind of the oncology MSL team. So it does feel a little more intimate. It does feel a little more like a little kind of family setting instead of such a large, broad company.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have that, varied experience, being able to have a well-rounded background where you have experience in diagnostics, you have experience in pharma, experience with small company, experience with large company. I think it creates a very nice, well-rounded career. So that said, let's just say there's somebody listening right now that is interested in applying for positions and taking the path of becoming a diagnostics MSL. Specific advice would you give to that person in how they might approach that search in diagnostics versus a search in pharma?
To be honest, I don't know that there's necessarily a whole lot of difference in terms of how you would actually search for a position like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that a lot of people, when I was first looking to break into this role, and I was, an aspiring MSL, a lot of people just kind of said, take whatever you can get at the beginning because it's really hard to break into, and then you can figure out where you want to go from there. And I think that kind of does apply, just because once you have a little bit of experience as an MSL, it does make it much easier to get to that next position. But if someone does have like a specific interest in going into diagnostics, I think in terms of the actual products that the company is focused on, that's the main difference, right? So in diagnostics, you're primarily looking at diagnostic tests. So when I was at Biodesics, we had blood tests that was the main product that we looked at. So knowing some of the details about how those tests are conducted, knowing what it is, a lot of these were mass spec based assays, so making sure that you understand a little bit of the methodology that goes into it, and once you get a patient sample, what happens to it? How is it that you determine one result versus another? So those are the questions that you have to consider in diagnostics. Whereas in pharma, it's much more focused on phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials in order to be able to approve a drug. So you have to understand the nuances of the drug discovery and development kind of pipeline, and understand why it is that this particular drug is, what the differences between those phases are, and why this drug might be in one specific spot in that pipeline versus another. And it's much more focused on the mechanism of action, and it's much more focused on the safety profile and just how efficacious it is compared to what else is on the market. So the specific questions that these companies are looking at are very different. So that's what you need to focus on if you want to apply to one versus another. So it really kind of has to be tailored. But in terms of general preparation, networking applies to everybody, regardless of whether or not you want to be an MSL or not. And, just kind of being prepared for interviews, those kinds of things are always going to be universal.
Well, you bring up a good point. Like I always tell people to be prepared to ask really good questions when you're in interviews. Would there be a difference? Like, would you say that there might be a difference in how you might pose those questions on a pharma interview versus a diagnostics interview?
Yeah, so because when I came into biodesics, some of the questions that I had were much more generic just because I'd never been in this role before. So I wanted to know a little bit about, how you interact with other teams, how, you may work with R&D versus marketing, something like that. And I think that kind of applies no matter where you go. But when I moved into pharma, one of the things that I wanted to know was some of the nuances that we discussed earlier. So like, what exactly does your relationship with commercial look like, and how does that differ from like what I'd seen in the past, essentially. um, and what is it about KOL relationships that I should know about? Like, do you, what is the process to maybe like, have a presentation and like a slide deck get approved, things like that. So there are some subtle nuances there. And I think the questions that you ask can be tailored to that. So for instance, if you're in diagnostic, you might want to know a little bit about their AI platform, if that's something that they're working on. You might want to understand why they use this kind of mass spec versus another. So you can kind of get a little more deeply scientific into those questions, and really make sure that whatever you're asking is going to be specific to that company and the products that they support.
Great advice. That's really, really good advice. Yeah, I think it's so important. You have to do your preparation, your homework, and you have to be prepared to ask those really good questions. What about like
Absolutely.
now that you've developed this experience and career for yourself, and you could take a step back and look at what it took to get you there? What advice would you have for someone who's looking to, like an aspiring MSL, looking to break into industry? Would you say that there's an easier path as far as companies and types of companies that they should be pursuing?
So I think that no matter what, there are going to be unique challenges that you'll face.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I, told you from my journey, I ended up coming into the kind of science communication, science writing career, and then I transitioned from there. So that can be like a good avenue for a lot of people. But in terms of the type of company you want to look at for breaking in, there are, so in my experience, I remember when I was still applying, I had some people tell me, oh, diagnostics is much easier to break into. And other people told me pharma is much easier to break into. And other people told me a large versus a small company is easier to break into. And just in my own experience, I do know that because of some of the differences just between how the MSL team functions between diagnostics and pharma, I actually, one of my supervisors in biodesics, she actually preferred hiring brand new MSLs who had never had any experience before because kind of pardon the cliche, but it's like a clean slate, right? So you can kind of teach that person how you interact in this one company. And if you switch from diagnostics to pharma, you're so used to being within this realm of, I have to have a very strict firewall with commercial, that a lot of MSLs who make that transition, they're almost paralyzed when they get to diagnostics because it's almost second nature for them to not interact with commercial, if you know what I mean. So because of that, she actually preferred people who she could kind of coach, and she could teach them what it was to be in this one particular type of company, and not someone who'd already had experience in a different type of company, if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. Yeah, and it's uh, I think that there's nuances to that job search and to
Absolutely.
trying to get an angle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it all comes back to you got to just put in the effort, put in the networking, get yourself out there. But what about experienced MSLs? Would you, as far as your advice, would you say that someone that is an experienced MSL, let's just say on the pharma side, would you recommend that they consider making that transition to the diagnostic side? I mean, you went from the diagnostic side to
Mm-hmm.
pharma. Would you say that, hey, I think it's a great way to build your background and gain a different level of experience if they went in reverse?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there's, no matter where you go, there's always something to learn.
Hmm.
And wherever you are, whichever company you're at, you're seeing one piece of the puzzle, right? So the
Yep.
more experience you have, the better it's going to be. So I can kind of give you an example. It just so happens that the diagnostic company that I was at, as well as the pharma company that I was at, it just so happens that I'm kind of in the same therapeutic space.
Hmm.
I mostly work on lung cancer, specifically non-small cell lung cancer. Um, and within non-small cell lung cancer, generally when a patient gets diagnosed, they will go through and have a series of different biomarker tests that are done to see if you might be able to find a treatment that is specific to a mutation they have. And
Hmm.
if not, then there are other options like chemotherapy, immunotherapy, things like that. So right now, most of what my focus is on immunotherapy from the pharma side. But I think there's a lot of value in knowing what those biomarker tests are, what those diagnostic tests are that a patient will often go through before they get to immunotherapy. So it certainly kind of helps you fit a lot of those pieces together to be able to see all of that. I would certainly encourage anyone who wants to kind of expand their breadth of knowledge to be able to see all of that, to be able to say, I understand how this testing is done, and as a result of this test, I think that this is how this physician would determine the best course of treatment for this patient. So I think that just as a scientist and as like someone who's involved in this like medical profession, it's always nice to have like that breadth of knowledge and be able to say that I've kind of seen both parts of this. And I can even say that while I was at Biodesics, I was our team was kind of building out, and I did a lot of interviews then. And one of the things that I wanted to know from people, it wasn't so much necessarily that did they have experience or not in the MSL role, but it was how they were able to kind of learn about this kind of stuff. And were they able to understand, were they kind of open to learning the differences between whatever their current role was and how they were able to transition. So I wanted to learn a little bit about did they have experience doing um, uh, things like publications? Did they have experience with working in large teams? Did they have experience working maybe with their marketing team? So having that skill set is always going to be beneficial, I think, for anybody. And being able to show that you've had different types of experiences is always going to be important for a company. So I would definitely encourage anyone, if you are interested in learning kind of the other side of science, then absolutely go for it.
Yeah, well, and I tell you, there's, just looking at your background, I think again, it's very well rounded, and I think that sometimes, depending on what your career preferences are and personal preferences are,
Mhm.
it's always good to build up your resume. And people always ask me, well, if I go from, let's just say, and I'm not saying this is a specific question, but I get questions like this. If I go from an MSL role in a pharma company to a diagnostics company, how hard is it going to be for me in the future if I need to switch back or whatever? And the thing is, when you have a good background, you're a good performer, you have good career experience, trajectory, stability in your career, you have a lot of the things that companies look for. They're not going to penalize you from going from pharma to diagnostics or diagnostics for pharma. Like, I don't think anybody's going to look at you and say, oh no, well, that's a
No.
black eye on there. You know what I mean? I, I,
Yeah,
I
no.
I mean, I think it's what's most interesting or of interest to companies is, what did you do? Are you like, if you're looking for somebody who has an oncology MSL background, well, they're looking for somebody with that experience. So if you have that, you can check those boxes. So I just want to throw that in there because I always I always like to bring everything back to the recruiting and the hiring and the career development side, obviously, because that's where I come from. So I'll let
Yeah,
you
I totally agree with you.
I'll let you close this out. Any final advice as we start to enter into 2023? So it's December right now. We're going into a new year. What's your advice for folks, for MSLs going into next year?
So I mean, I think I might be a little biased in saying this, but I think that it's a wonderful time to be in medical affairs and to be an MSL. And like I said, I have absolutely loved my new position that I've been in. And I've just learned so much. So I think no matter what, as we're kind of hopefully, getting COVID in the rearview mirror, and hopefully being able to move out, I think it's a great time to be in this role, because you are finally able to go and have in-person meetings with KOLs, and you're finally able to really engage with people and kind of connect on like a deeper level, compared to just having virtual meetings all the time. So because of that, I think 2023 is going to be a great year, hopefully. Um, and for anyone who's looking to break into this role, I know that at the beginning it's difficult. Like, you do face quite a bit of rejection, and it can kind of be disheartening. But I would just say keep at it, because it took me a little while to break in, but I'm so happy that I finally made it into this position. It's like I still can't believe that I get paid to do this job. Like, it's a wonderful position, and I think that MSLs bring like a unique passion to their job. Like, they're very excited about the work, they're very excited about the science, and they're very excited about the opportunity to actually be able to influence a patient's life, and know that you're making a positive difference. So especially in the field that I'm in, it's just a field that is advancing and evolving so quickly. We have so many like new FDA approvals that have come out in just the past couple of years. So it's an exciting place to be. And I encourage anyone who wants to break in or is considering switching to a new role that it's a wonderful time to do it.
And you're such a great advocate for the role and for the profession. I mean, I can hear the energy and passion in your voice. So it's I'm really glad that you came on and did this. You were awesome. And
Thank you.
we'll
It
have
was
to
really
do this.
exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'll do this again sometime. So thank you for coming on, guys. Thank you for listening. I don't know when exactly this is coming out, but we are in the holiday season. So happy holidays to everyone, and be safe, be well. All the best for 2023. Namratha, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And happy holidays, everyone. And if this comes out after the new year, then happy new year.
Yeah, that too. All right, guys. Take care now. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future. And feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.